All right, so I hope everybody can see that screen. Is that working for you there? Yep, fantastic. Okay, excuse me. So as Jackie said, my name's Ailie Gallant. I'm from the Monash University School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment. I'm a climate scientist. That's what I do for a living, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, the latest in some climate science and interesting stuff that's relevant to the city of Stonnington. Just as an aside, I'm also the Deputy Director of the Monash Climate Change Communications Research Hub, and you may have seen some of our weekly columns in the Leader when it used to exist every week talking about climate information. So I'll show you a few updated graphs from that as well. So before I go on, I just want to talk I want to talk about a few things today, but I also want to just acknowledge that I am on the land of the people of the Kulin Nations, and I do pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. All right, let's get started. So what does climate change mean for Stonnington, and what does it mean for Melbourne more broadly? I wanted to start with a few images that I've been, kind of collecting over the years and hunting down for this talk, because Melbourne has a really colourful climate history, we'll call it. Melbourne and Stonnington and, all around the city of Greater Melbourne, we kind of have this discussion that we're 4 seasons in one day. We have to go outside with an umbrella, a t-shirt and a thick winter coat. And when we think about Melbourne and climate, we always think of this really highly variable climate. We think, well, yes, it can get hot. It can, or at least it used to, snow sometimes. The middle image is actually of snow falling in Collins Street in Melbourne in the early 1950s. And we're used to this kind of, summer storms. This is a fabulous image on the far left here of a train on what's now, I believe, the Cranbourne Dandenong line going through South Yarra during a flood in the summer of 1907. And of course, on the far right, St Kilda Beach during a heat wave. So I suppose my point here is that, we are a city where climate is variable. We are a city where climate, can be unexpected. So I suppose in that context, what's changing about that into the future? We're a variable climate. We're used to these big changes. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware, if you're here, you're obviously concerned about the issue, but I just wanted to show you how much Stonnington has warmed. Now, when we say Stonnington here, these are some graphs that have been put together by the Monash Climate Change Communications Research Hub. I should say these are from a temperature gauge at Olympic Park. Now, this is the city gauge. This is one that's been running for 100 or more years. It was recently moved, but we've adjusted for that in these plots. So these just basically show how much things have changed since the early 1970s. And this is around the time that warming really started to ramp up. So in the top left there, I've got the hottest day during summer, which these days is around about 3 degrees warmer than it used to be. On the top right here, I've got, warm nighttime temperatures above 15 degrees Celsius. There's 2 more of those than there used to be approximately since the 1970s. And if we think about winters too, they've warmed quite significantly, although it doesn't seem like it today, perhaps, for those who are in Melbourne. So our coldest winter days warmed by around 1.6 degrees. And in particular, those really cold winter days, this is just an example from July. So this is July winter days below 15 degrees Celsius have really dropped off. So no surprises, we have warmed. We've also broadly dried. Excuse me. So outside summer we have a drying trend, but it's not what we would call significant at this point. But from autumn to spring, particularly in the last kind of 50 years, we've seen this really strong drying trend across southern Australia. As far afield as Perth, all the way through to Melbourne and southern parts of Victoria. And you can see that reflected in these metrics here. So summer rain days are around 3.5 summer rain days less than they were in the 1950s. That said, rainfall's highly variable, so this trend actually isn't hugely significant. But if we look at autumn and winter and spring, you can see really large changes in rain as well. So it's really dried out. Now, when I say rain days here, these are those days with kind of substantial rain. So this is more than 5 millimeters of rain. So the heavier rain days and days with kind of those soaking rains have really dropped off. So those are the changes that have happened in Stonnington. But when we think about changes, particularly in temperature, I showed some changes that were quite large. One thing we have to remember as well is that it's hot in cities. And we have to think about, as scientists, these things called the urban heat island in particular. So the urban heat island is this phenomena where we basically get all the concrete and the asphalt and what we call the anthropogenic heat from cities. So that's literally car exhausts and if you're using air conditioners, the heat that pumps out the other side might make it cold inside, but it makes it hot outside. And all those different things go into this urban heat island. So this is a fantastic plot on the left from Andrew Coots, who was at Monash University. And he published this back in 2016. And he did this great experiment where he put this rig on his car or on the university cars and drove across the city a few times on a night in March and measured this urban heat island. And you can really see he drove from Rockbank in the northwest across to Beaconsfield in the southeast. And you can see he drove through Stonnington, and you can see the magnitude of the urban heat island where it's showing kind of 3-4 degrees warmer in the cities than it is in the outer suburbs and those peri-urban areas. For this particular night in March. And that's quite typical of what we see from cities. So how do we know that those changes that we've seen in Stonnington in terms of temperature aren't from the urban heat island? Well, some of that warming is contributed by the urban heat island, but certainly not the majority. So this temperature change that we see in Stonnington and in Greater Melbourne is broadly the same across the state of Victoria. It's just a little bit larger in the cities. Now, it's really interesting with this urban heat island because what we do find, this urban heat island basically gives us a bit of a double whammy in cities. So not only do we have the effect of warming from climate change, and we'll have that into the future, but we also have an effect from this urban heat island. Now, this can be really important, particularly during heat waves. This is some work that a student of mine, Cassandra Rogers, did and published back in 2019, basically showing in Melbourne and a couple of other Australian cities that the urban heat island effect is actually exacerbated during heat waves. So not only do we get an urban heat island effect when vulnerability is highest in the community during heat waves, it actually gets worse. So basically what the plot shows here is these dark red colours and the lighter red colours. This shows the progression through an average heat wave in Melbourne, which typically lasts 3 days. And it shows that on the second day of the heat wave, somewhat's upwards of kind of 70-80% of those heat waves are made worse. The urban heat island, is made worse during those heat waves, as opposed to a regular urban heat island. So it's something that we have to think about. So what does this mean for Stonnington? It means that with climate change, not only are we going to have to deal with the effects of temperature change associated with climate, and this is just from an example of a single climate model in 2050 and 2090, showing temperature changes of around kind of 2 degrees upwards, of 3 to 4 degrees over Melbourne in the next 50 to 80 years. We also have to deal with the fact that we live in a city, and Stonnington is in a city, and that we get these additional heat effects from cities as well. So when we think about what we can do about that, we have to think about both those components. And I'm just going to go over the first component, the climate change component first, and then I'm going to talk briefly about the city component, because we can actually do something about that part, which is really, really interesting and really encouraging. So first, before I talk about the climate change component, I just want to give a brief overview of how we make our climate change projections, because I think this gets a little bit lost sometimes. People often think we extrapolate from past trends and just think, oh yeah, how's it going to change into the future? But in fact, that's not what we do at all. What we do is we put information into very sophisticated physical models. So these models are based on physics and nothing else. They're not based on past trends. We put changes to atmospheric constituents, so carbon dioxide, methane, those types of things. And we actually model the weather and the climate much like we would forecast the weather. So this is just an example on the right here of a simulation from a climate model and a satellite observation. And you can see how closely these two things align. I'm not actually going to tell you which one's real and which one's from the model. So basically what we do is we chop the Earth up into tiny little boxes and we solve these physical equations in each of these boxes, and these boxes push heat and moisture and things around in the atmosphere. And yeah, so that's how we work out what's going to happen into the future. Now, because we have to chop the Earth up into little boxes, sometimes over the scale of cities like Melbourne, and particularly at the LGA scale like over Stonnington, we can't actually resolve these things particularly well. And what that means is that there are some limitations on what climate models in their present configuration can simulate directly. But that's not to say that they're not super useful. And what we find is that some things that we can look into in the future are much more certain than others. And one of those things that we can look to in the future that is virtually certain, which is really, really strong language for a scientist, I have to say. Scientists never say anything's virtually certain. So this tells us that our models are consistent and that they're showing us this will happen, is that warming is virtually certain, even at the city scale. So this is just an example of the hottest day of the season. This is looking across southern Victoria and southeastern New South Wales, because we can't drill really right down to the city scale very well. But this is looking at the absolute change in the hottest day of the season. So you can see on the far left, summer, in the middle, autumn and winter, and on the far right, spring. Now, each of these bar graphs shows in blue what is expected under a lower emissions scenario. So this is kind of if we start to transition into a fossil-free future very, very quickly. And the pink shows what happens if we don't. So you can see as we get further out, the grey shows what we can expect from the observations. And then you can see in the next kind of 20 years and then thereafter right to the end of the 21st century. But what I wanted to point out from this plot was two things. And the first thing is that unfortunately, there's at least some climate change, and pardon the pun, effectively baked into the system. Okay, you can see that with the blue, this is realistically the fastest we could transition here, and even under those scenarios, the blue situation tells us we're going to have some warming by the end of the 21st century, on the order of perhaps 1 to 2 degrees. The red, on the other hand, shows us what's likely to happen if we kind of continue as business as usual, so to speak, and that kind of bakes in 4 to 6 degrees warming by the end of the 21st century. So in that sense, the other key message that I wanted to get across here was not only do we have at least some warming baked into the system, but the other thing here is that our decisions now about mitigation matter. So while there will have to be some adaptation because things will warm into the future regardless of what we do now, if we do take mitigation measures on a larger scale, on a global scale, that will matter, particularly towards the end of the 21st century, with how much warming is baked into the system, so to speak. So there's a little bit, but how much really depends on us now. So again, what does that mean for Stonnington? That means that we're going to get at least some warming, okay? And so we're going to have to consider both mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies. But as I said, the other part of this equation, which is really, really useful, is that we have this thing called the urban heat island, which kind of sits on top of this warming, and that we can do something about. So I just wanted to finish up by showing you some interesting work that another PhD student of mine, Steph Jacobs, did back in 2018. And she was using a very small model to look, not small, I should say, a small scale model. It was a very complex model actually, but a small scale model to look at urban mitigation strategies over the city of Melbourne. And specifically, she was looking at it during heat wave conditions. And she was looking at, things like the implementation of cool roofs. So this is the idea where you paint roofs white in order to reflect some of the incoming solar radiation and cool the city streets. And she was looking at increases in vegetation. So this is kind of simulating increases in street trees, urban vegetation in parks, green roofs and green buildings and things like that. And so on the left here, this is the kind of strategies that would work in the current environment. This is how much cooling they would provide. So the blue indicates, the bluer it is, indicates cooling. And then in the middle panel here, you see this is under a future climate change scenario. So this is considering how much cooling we would have in a situation in the future where we had both the climate change on top and the warming associated with climate change on top of the urban heat island. And it's probably not coming through so well on your screens there, but what I can show you is that the blue is definitely stronger in the future climate change scenario, where we get reductions of 1.5 degrees or more, particularly in the inner city and the inner suburb area, which includes Stonnington, in the future climate change scenario. So it really does help basically temper the impacts of climate change into the future there. But that's all I have to say. And that's some of the research that we've been doing on climate change in cities. And hopefully that's given you an update of where we are with the science of climate change. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Ailie. I must say, for such a complex area, you did a great job in, making that quite easy to understand for people like me. It's not my background, but thank you, and amazing graphs and figures. So thank you for taking the time. And I loved what you said that I jotted down, which is around, these decisions that we make now really matter. And I think that's so important for us to keep in mind as we go through what the plan is saying and what we hope to achieve, because the decisions that we and the decisions that Stonnington Council make now really do matter when you look into the future and those different scenarios. So thank you for raising that wonderful point. I'm now going to hand over to our second speaker for the night, Dr. Liz Hanna. So Liz is from the Australian National University, and she's really going to talk about how climate change is going to have an effect on our health and wellbeing. So we've heard from the science now, but what does this mean for us as humans and as communities? Thank you, Liz. And Liz is going to share her screen as well. And you're on mute still, Liz.
Unmute now.
Perfect.
Okay, and you can see the screen? Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you. And again, congratulations for Stonnington for developing up a climate action plan. Absolutely fabulous thing to do. And I'm talking to you today from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. I'm honorary at the Australian National Uni, has been mentioned. I also chair environmental health for the World Federation of Public Health Associations, and I'm on the World Health Organization panel for climate change and human health and other stuff for my sins. Okay, so Allie's run through the science. What's really important here to get a handle on is that the entire world is heating. And so particularly the hot bits are getting hotter. Even though the warming is stronger at the poles, the hot countries are getting hotter, and Australia is a hot country. So as a summary of how heat, because I'll be focusing mostly on heat because we've had a very contracted time frame here, all across the world, there's a similar sort of relationship between how people cope with the heat. And when you consider, when we're talking about heat, the really important thing is that we have physiologically, we have a very narrow range of our core temperature that makes us happy. If our core temp goes down below 35 or so, which is what we used to do because I did nursing at the Alfred, so I've had some good happy times in Stonnington. We actually pour chilled saline into the chest to cool the heart to about 35, which will make it fibrillate so we can operate on a heart. And so we don't do well when our core temperature is low. We also don't do very well when our core temperature goes too high. You know, we like it between about 36.5, 37.5 is sort of ideal. When our core temperature goes up much over about 38 or so, we start feeling pretty ordinary. 38.5, we're feeling quite sick. Seriously unwell if our temp is up to 39. Once your temperature is up around the 40, you know, for a long period of time, you can do serious damage. And if you think in terms of the whites of an egg in a microwave, we are largely protein, and we get denaturing of the proteins. So we actually get cellular damage. If it's on a very large scale, that ends up as organ damage. And of course, we know that can be fatal. I'll be running through a little bit of this, but not really going too much into the physiology, but just to explain what it is about the body that makes us so vulnerable to heat, and why heat and warming is a climate emergency and a health emergency. So this slide, because one of the things we do with our heat research and climate and heat research is we look at the death rates and align those to the daily temperature. And what you can see here is that there's a Goldilocks zone where people are happy. Now, that doesn't move a great deal from country to country. And you can see that more people die as the temperature is lower. But what's really important, so we can adapt to cold. And so if you think of the fact, and the reason for this, of course, is that we've been evolving for millions of years, but Homo sapiens sapien, we've been around for 250, 300,000 years. Most of that was a lot colder than now. So we are physiologically, we are adapted to cold weather. We've survived ice ages. And so when it's cold, we hid in cages, we lit fires, we peeled animals and wore their skins. Nowadays, we're a little bit more civilized. We turn on little switches and we have heating and wear clothes. So adaptation to cold is a lot easier. What's problematic is that as the temperature rises, there's a very steep rise in the death rate, which actually demonstrates that it's very difficult to adapt to the heat. And this is why we're very, very concerned about the rising heat. I've popped up the references from articles that I've written about this in case people are wanting to track it down a bit later. Don't be frightened about this one, because I'm going to be working through it just to highlight the specific factors and why heat is a problem. So this grey box here is pretty much the human body. So all this is inside, all that stuff is outside. And what we know, of course, is that we respond to the external environment, whether it's a hot day, cold day. Humidity, and I'll get onto that a little bit more in a moment. Humidity is very significant in terms of our perception of heat. And of course, what clothing we wear really moderates the temperature. The key point that we're worried about, of course, is maintaining a core body temperature. And the way we do this, as I've alluded, is that we have a very, very complex, very efficient thermoregulatory system. And that maintains us between that very narrow band that keeps us happy and alive, and all our organ function operates perfectly within this very narrow band. So what is this thing? Well, if we're talking of heat, the thermoregulation, the key point is how we go about keeping cool. So we've got physiological characteristics. Our heart rate increases, our cardiac output increases, our sweating increases, and we dilate particularly the blood vessels to the skin. And physiologically, that's how we cool. So we're designed to cool, often it's from exercise. We open up because we're trying to shed heat to the environment. This is when it's really problematic, when it's 35 or above our core temperature. Then it's very difficult because we're trying to lose heat to the environment. If the outside environment is hotter than us, then it's very hard to shed heat. So we store it. And as we store it, our core temperature rises. The sweating is our main cooling mechanism. And that's we exchange. So we sweat, we lose about 6 kilocalories of heat, of energy from our skin for every gram of water. So if the air is humid, like Darwin, there's not much gradient. The air's saturated with water, our skin's saturated with water. evaporation is not going to happen. And of course, we all know that 35 degrees in Darwin or those sort of places is much, much worse than a 35-degree day in Melbourne. Not that that's very nice. And so if you can't sweat, you can't lose your temperature, shed heat to the environment, then you start storing heat and becoming really uncomfortable. Now, the other behavioural things are, of course, we take our clothes off. Well, that's a bit problematic. Whereas we can keep piling clothes on, there's a limit to how many clothes we can take off in public. Drinking cold fluids, we rest. We're motivated to rest because we get fatigue. Our body is telling us to stop exercising, because when we exercise, the energy in muscles, 80% of that is heat. It's really not very effective. But again, that's actually part of our thermoregulation of moving, generates heat. So it was a great mechanism for keeping warm, particularly through those ice ages. We also try to seek shade and access cooling. So back to this ugly looking schematic here. There, the internal factors are our capacity to sweat, our cardiac capacity, and our blood volume. Now, this explains that if you're hot and your sweating kicks up, then your blood pressure drops. And the reason that drops is that we're dilating our vessels, and they're tubes. So you've got the same amount of blood in bigger open space with all these tubes opened up. Your blood pressure drops. Your heart tries to compensate, and so it beats faster and it beats stronger, which is the increase in cardiac output. So if your cardiac function is not good, as in you've got heart disease, you're old, you're unfit, then your heart cannot cope with the extra. If you sweat a lot, that makes it worse because you're hypovolemic, as in you haven't got enough fluid inside the blood vessels. And that's why we need to drink. So people should be drinking and passing urine all the way through heat waves a lot, and the colour should be very pale. And we cannot stress this enough as to how to maintain your optimal chance of surviving heat waves is by drinking. And so what makes people vulnerable, as I said, if your heart can't respond to what it needs to do, those with poor cardiac function, they're highly vulnerable. If people are dehydrated and they're not sweating, that increases their vulnerability. It also limits how much they can sweat, but it also feeds back into the extra work that the heart has to do to try to keep you alive. And same thing with the dilation of those skin vessels. So people who are also vulnerable are those on certain medications, people who have a tendency for a low blood pressure, people are sometimes on antihypertensives, people are on medications that stop their heart going fast. So there's all manner of medications that can interfere with your physiological response. They need checking with the GP to make sure that during heat waves, there's something else that can be taken. And as far as the behavioural responses to maintain a happy normal thermal temperature in the heat, there's a raft of vulnerabilities as well with that. Workers, I mean, people, if they're working in various areas, that again, there's a limit to how many clothes they have to take off. Some people need to wear protective clothing, which is problematic. People who are unaware of the risks, or particularly with drinking fluids, people who are unaware that they need to drink more. Now, the elderly, they, much like many of their other senses, start to dissipate as you're getting older. Their self-perception of I'm too hot, I'm too cold, I'm too thirsty is not as efficient as when you're 18 years old. And so, and there's been a lot of studies that have actually shown that. So with the elderly in particular, don't just ask them, would you like a drink, dear? Make sure they do have a drink, because they feel as if they're okay and they're not. They are still dehydrated. People who are at risk are those where fluids are not available. As far as resting, stopping your physical exercise, heat generating physical movement, is an adaptive response, except that there are people who can't rest. There are silly athletes who think, oh, it's hot and I'll still go for a run. Very silly. People who are carers, people who are responsible for, for projects, for people, for animals, zookeepers, parents, farmers, district nurses, essential service people, they all need to continue to go and be active. And so they're quite likely to keep pushing themselves when it's very hot. And workers, I mean, there are people who, if you take the roof off a house, you really can't, say, oh no, I'm going home now. And so there's, working situations where people can't give up work and pack up and go home. The seeking shade is what we'd always like to do to get out of the heat. And people that don't have self-determination. Again, that could be in an employment setting or a financial setting, or if there just isn't shade around, that can increase people's vulnerability. And of course, accessing cooling. There seems to be a myth around that air conditioning is going to save us. And it's wonderful. It's absolutely positively wonderful, but there are power blackouts. And there's increasing evidence coming around globally of increasing power failures during extreme heat events where people are forced to live in these accommodation without air conditioning. And so if people can't afford it, or it's not functioning, or it's unaffordable, then people are in strife. The other thing we often notice also is that there's complaints that people say their air conditioning isn't working, but if it's 45 degrees and you want to bring it down to 23 degrees, the unit's working flat chat. That's a huge temperature drop. It might be working flat chat. It's working its hardest. It's not broken. It's just the demand exceeds the unit's capacity to take the heat out of the air. So people need to factor that in, that air conditioning can't make it super cool, isn't always working, isn't always affordable or available. So again, it's one of our major sources of vulnerability. So if you put all those things together, we've got things that can limit and can compromise the physiological and the behavioural components of keeping yourself cool, is obesity, age, having comorbidities and other illnesses, certain medications, aerobic fitness if that is poor. And acclimatisation is really relevant for Melbourne, because Melbourne gets hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, whereas in Perth we know it gets hot in summer and then it just gets hotter. Adelaide gets hot in summer and just gets hotter, which explains why Melbourne has very, very high heat mortality and morbidity, because acclimatisation is very difficult in Melbourne, where we have this cyclical temperature. And I can take a little bit of credit, because John Nairn, who was Deputy Director of the Bureau in South Australia, and I was grizzling to him about why, the Bureau needs to do something to help Melbournians identify the risk because of this changeable temperature, which is why he brought in the excess heat factor, which averages out the temperature for the last 30 days. And so that accommodates that, and that actually works in many other countries as well. So acclimatisation, my message is acclimatisation is very difficult in a town like Melbourne. So we mentioned, sorry to rattling on so quickly here, I've mentioned that your cardiovascular fitness and aerobic fitness improves thermal tolerance, because you've got a stronger heart that can do it. That reduces the risk of harm, injury and death. But what we've got is an increasing, with the population changes, we've got increasing obesity, increasing sedentarianism, where people are sitting more, the population is aging. All these increase the risks. So as far as population health is concerned, we're quite concerned, as we're facing an inevitable warming, and many of the characteristics are increasing. What I've got on these little slides is that your sweat rate versus the core temperature, and you can see that the fit and acclimatise, they increase sweating and their sweat rate is much higher, and the less able groups are the fit, normal and unfit. And the same thing with your skin blood flow, the fact that you can increase the skin flow through your skin. Again, the fit and the acclimatized do a lot better than the unfit. So this one is working. How are we going to keep functioning? This is one of the studies that I did. I looked at people working in the heat, and it's over 1,000 worker days, where I sat workers, and these are people who know about the heat. They work outdoors in hot areas, and I did this across Australia. And so initially, I asked them just to write down on this enrolment sheet is what temperature did they think would be hard to keep working? What's a hot day for them that it might be uncomfortable? I then gave them heat diaries, and we tracked that through summer, through months of summer, while I put temperature and humidity instrumentation where they were working, not using the bureau, which is a little way away, but where they were working, amongst the concrete or whatever, and asked them to fill out a daily diary in how hot they felt, how much, how productive they felt they were, and to report any symptoms. So what we found is that when temperatures were under 30, 70% of the people could work at about 90% capacity or more. So they're really working pretty much full bore, and only 2% of the population working groups were working less than about 70%. But on the hot days, days that were over 35, that dropped dramatically, and only 41% of the population could work at full bore. And those who were working less than 70% had increased to almost a third. And I did the same sort of thing when I factored in humidity. The results are very much the same, because of course, when you're exercising and you're sweating, if it's humid, you can't cool down, so their capacity. So this doesn't only apply to people who are working outside, it's how you function, it's how we're going to work out and go to the shops and pick up the children and commute and do all those things.
Thanks, Liz. I'm just going to have to give you a couple of minutes because we are running a bit over time, if you're happy to start wrapping up.
Okay, so thanks. So basically what we found was that they overestimated. These are the temperatures where they said sitting down, they thought it'd be too hot to work. Much cooler on the days when we measured. In their diaries, they said they were very hot and they couldn't keep working, and symptoms kicked in a lot earlier. So the message is that we really do need education campaigns for everyone, not just those working in the heat. And we've mentioned Urban Heat Island. This is the new housing. This is actually from Canberra. And you notice, this is all around Australia, the new black rooftops and lack of trees of spaces. Measured the temperature, it's 30 degrees hotter in the roof space in houses with black roofs. That's significant. And so we should really, really stop hot roofs. This is Google Maps of Stonnington. It's a challenge. So trying to increase the canopy and space when you've got such high density population is a real challenge for Stonnington. This is Canberra. This is also another project. 7 degrees cooler in these leafy suburbs versus the new suburbs when there are no trees. Why are trees so important? It's this temperature difference, 7 degrees on the hottest days, is the difference between life and death. I mean, it's absolutely critical. So we really do need to maximize our tree coverage and obviously have systems to water them, because the trees need to survive and not kill out in the heat. So this is my last slide. And I've just put this because I get very cross. This is a global study that came out last week. Again, we're trying to look at the climate fingerprint on heat mortality around the world. They looked at 732 locations using data from 91 to 18. And you notice here that Australia could only provide data up to 2009, which is 12 years old, and we could only provide data for 3 locations. Whereas what breaks my heart is that we find that the developing countries, Panama, Colombia, Paraguay, Uruguay, they could provide data up to 2016. And why is Australia lagging behind? Because the federal government stopped the NH and MRC funding for climate change and human health and sent all of Australia's climate change and human health researchers into unemployment. And so we could stop training. We had to stop training our PhD students. We had to stop teaching the courses. I've been honorary for years. And this is why we have to put on the handball over to the councils and everyone to start acting to do everything we can to keep the temperature down. Sorry, I said this was the last. I'll run through this very quickly. So how did we get to this point of risking our own survival? Answer is we took the environment for granted, which is systemic. It permeated governance and economics and even to people's own mindsets. Short-termism, we've been thinking of just recent and not actually looking at the long-term events, and we discount the distant future. People have been not really factoring in the seriousness of the problem that we're facing. They've ignored global scientific evidence, which has been going on for 3-4 decades now. There's been a deliberate misinformation campaign, largely by the certain media and uninformed celebrities and people who are making money out of fossil fuels. Also, there's nearsightedness. People have been, obsessed with their own thing, and of course, the important task of feeding children. What are we having for dinner? But this lack of interest in the broader world and keeping tabs on what's happening around the world means that people have been not really thinking beyond themselves and even ignoring future generations. The last one is that people are suffering this sort of sense of insignificance. It's little old me, what can I do versus this huge climate change problem? And what we need to think about is that collectively we got to this point. We're all responsible for the climate change as it is now. And so collectively we need to reverse the trend. And those of us in the rich countries obviously contributed more. So we can be the solution. We need to be the solution, and our role moving forward is doing everything we can, but also to bring everyone with us, because councils with these wonderful plans, they can only move those forward if their locality and the people voting for them let them do it. So we need to make sure that everybody is very, very keen, that all the councils, all the governments, all the businesses do everything they can to prevent this, because it's not going to be good.
Thank you, Liz. That's a great segue to the next speaker. So I just wanted to tie that together. So we had Ailie telling us, the science behind us, and had that great comment around our decisions matter. And, Liz really brought it home for not only does it matter, but those decisions have a real impact on life and death in the community as well. And, that was really shocking hearing that, particularly that 7-degree difference within the suburb with trees. That was, a huge insight. I wouldn't have even thought that was possible. So thank you so much for sharing that. I am going to move us quite swiftly on because we are struggling a little bit with time. So Jane Spence is from the City of Stonnington. I'm going to introduce her, who's going to talk us through what this plan looks like and a bit behind it. We do hope people have already read it, but Jane will give us a little bit of an overview before we go through some questions. And I've seen some great questions and comments already in the chat, so thank you. We will come to those and then we'll get into some group discussion. So thank you, Jane, who's going to share her screen as well.
Great. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks everybody for coming along tonight. Really appreciate your time on this very wintry evening. I'm going to be quick, just conscious of time, and we really want to provide some time for you to, I guess, let me just get all of my screen ready, for you to be able to feed and tell us what you think. So this is our first ever climate emergency action plan, and as our Mayor mentioned at the beginning, it followed our climate emergency declaration just over a year ago. There is a need for immediate and urgent action. Climate change is already impacting on council and our community, and it's going to continue to do so. And local government plays a really key role in driving that action at a local level, just as been reiterated there by Ailie and Liz. I want to just go quickly through. I think these emission profiles are a really important way to understand where emissions come from, but also those opportunities. And so you can see from our community emissions, just over half of emissions in the whole of Stonnington from residential and commercial buildings, electricity used in those, and industrial processes. So this then therefore is our largest opportunity to reduce emissions. And so when we're thinking about our climate emergency response, we're starting to look at, well, how do we reduce electricity related emissions? And for council's own corporate emissions, which is just under 1% of our total municipal emissions, electricity used in our buildings and street lighting is our really key opportunity, and we're actually really fortunate that we've been part of this incredible Victorian Energy collaboration, which was launched just a couple of weeks ago, and you may have heard about, where we'll be purchasing 100% renewable energy for all of that electricity use. So from the 1st of July, we are reducing our emissions by 65%, just like that, which is a really exciting thing for us, and probably just one of the biggest things that we could have done, and great to be part of such an awesome collaboration. Through that Victorian Energy collaboration, so as I mentioned, we're reducing our emissions, but we're reducing them by 76% below our baseline of 2005. And you can see in this graph here that we've been steadily reducing emissions over the last 10 or so years, because we've been, this climate emergency plan isn't our first plan. It's not the first time that we're acting on climate change. It's just our commitment to ramp up that response. And so we've been acting for many years on reducing our emissions through renewable energy. We have almost 1 megawatt of solar across the council's buildings and facilities. We've got LED lighting in our buildings and facilities and our street lights. We've been upgrading our buildings so that they're environmentally sustainable design and best practice, and we've got more efficient vehicles, as well as the support we've provided to our community. But you can see here that we have a 2030 target to reduce emissions by 60% below 2005 levels. And because of our involvement in the Victorian Energy collaboration, we're meeting that target, actually going well beyond it 10 years early. And so we'll start to turn our attention then, as I mentioned in that previous slide, to gas and then transport fuels. I'm probably going to be rushing this a lot. So to develop our climate emergency action plan, we spoke to you last year. We did a whole bunch of research into leading best practice. We looked at building on the work that we've been doing over the last 10 or so years. We collected more information through council's community vision and council plan engagement processes, and we ran a workshop with our councillors, and pulled all of that together and created this action plan that is really a whole of organisation approach, and it's a whole of community approach. We really need everybody on board, just as Liz was saying before me, for us to really be effective and to create a more sustainable future for all of us. So the plan's about mitigation and adaptation. So it's about reducing our emissions where we can, and it's about adapting to a changing climate, because we know that things are already changing. They will continue to do so, and we're getting hotter, we're getting drier. When rain comes down, it's coming down really hard. So how do we make the most of those kind of impacts and potentially opportunities? The plan is about council's own operations, our service delivery, the decisions that we make in our community. And it's also about the support that we're going to provide for the community. And that really requires that collective action and us all working together and working with all kinds of partnerships to beyond our borders as well. The action plan is framed around these 5 key priority areas and working towards a zero carbon future by 2030. I'll go through each of these just really briefly. So the first one here is our zero carbon Stonnington priority area number 1. And this is really about reducing emissions from Stonnington's own operations, and then also looking at how do we support that for our community. So that's through things like renewable energy. As I mentioned, we've got this Victorian Energy collaboration for council, but how do we support the community to install solar, to purchase green power, to look at other renewable energy options? How do we, support zero carbon developments? How do we support environmentally sustainable design in our own buildings and infrastructure, but also those within the community? And how do we transition to zero emission transport modes? So trying to get people out of their cars and into public transport, walking and cycling, and the support that we need to do that. And also the, carrots and sticks to also help. The second priority area is really around council's own climate emergency response. How do we integrate this throughout the whole of council into all of our policies, plans, decision-making, service delivery, and our operations really broadly, including how do we also support suppliers that we work with to, meet us and to work with us and to come along on this journey. And also how do we push state and federal governments to come along with us and to, create stronger targets, stronger policies and plans around this, so that we're all, as part of a whole community working towards this, because climate change doesn't know Stonnington borders, and we've declared a climate emergency, and how do we get everyone else alongside us? The next priority is around a cool climate adapted city. And as both Ailie and Liz have mentioned, the urban heat island is a really significant factor in this. So in Stonnington, lots of hard surfaces. So how do we create more space for trees and for other urban greening opportunities like green walls or environments for growing trees? We have a lot of difficulties because we have a lot of competing space. We've got really narrow areas for trees in Stonnington, commercial areas. So how do we really build this into that? How do we also protect and enhance biodiversity? How do we support corridors? How do we create nature connection? And how do we get people to be outside? Hi, if you're in here, can I just make sure that you're muting yourself, please? Thank you. So this one's very much about how do we just cool our city? How do we also support water sensitive urban design in the city? So some of the key elements of that are looking at alternative water sources as well, so we don't drain our drinking water supplies. A resilient connected communities all around building the bonds within our community. So when I'm talking about resilience, it's talking about those bonds that are created between community members that help us to better respond to the shocks that we may experience. So for example, from COVID, you may have seen a lot of this neighbourhood connectedness, a lot of people reaching out, supporting each other, getting to know their neighbours. And we want to really drive that because that really helps us when things like this happen or when we have more future, climate impacts, and we're better able to bounce back. And looking at how do we also mobilize the community to take action, and how do we get the community and reach out and engage them in what we're trying to do, and to get them to take action themselves at home by installing solar or supporting community groups to reach out to their networks as well. And how do we support a resilient local economy? How do we support local businesses, get them to take action, but also to get our community to link into those as well? And the last priority area is towards zero waste and a circular economy. And this is really about developing our waste and circular economy strategy, which we're currently developing. And this will really be a key element of this. But what it's really about is just avoiding waste in the first place and reducing anything that's going to landfill, particularly around things like organics and food waste, because that creates methane, which is a really dangerous greenhouse gas, but also making the most of resources that we recover. So how do we, use other recycled materials in council projects, or how do we support our community to look at reuse? So for example, our road resurfacing program now uses as a standard product an asphalt that contains soft plastics from supermarket soft plastics recycling collections. And so how do we continue to make the most of these opportunities for items that would otherwise go to landfill? And then the last one in that section is just looking at how do we support a circular economy, and looking at how do we create that reuse. And that really links a little bit back to the other one around a resilient local economy as well. And this is our climate emergency action plan, very much in a very fast snapshot. And what we'll be doing now is going into some of the discussion, but we really want to hear from you. This is a really great opportunity for you to tell us, have we got this right? What are we missing? What do we need to change or add in there? So that this is a plan that, it is a council plan, but it's really about all of us working together.